Hello, so this is a review of the Firefight rules by Mantic. Now Mantic has changed Warpath, so when I first started looking at it, it was very much based on the fantasy game, and it's been reworked somewhat, and part of the reworking was to split off some more skirmish based rules around the 40k level that I remember, that's second edition, kind of number of figures, and they've called this rule set Firefight. Now there's a lot of similarities between the two. Ultimately, if you can play one, they translate very easily to the other. The difference being that in Firefight, the smallest unit object that you can control is a single model, and in Warpath, the smallest unit you can control is a team of a couple of models each. So Firefight itself, I've played a few games of now, and I think I'm in a position to be able to discuss how it plays and what I like and don't like about it. And heads up, I really enjoy it. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't. There's some confirmation bias here. Like, I guess if you're reading or listening to this, sorry, that you also feel that it could be a good game as well. So my fondest memories come from playing 40k as a child, second edition, Rogue Trader, reading the rules and the backgrounds and playing with some friends. And we never had massive armies, and we never really had massive spaces to do it. So we always played in that intermediate space of around 1,000 points to 1,500 points maximum in second edition. And that really meant maybe for Space Marines, there were 300 points per squad. So you'd have, say, 2 squads of Space Marines, a character and a tank, or something like that, and that would be your whole force. And Firefight does that scale of conflict really well. I tried Gates of Antares, and I found that it was too arbitrary. There wasn't although the models I think are better, the actual gameplay was pretty rote. I found not like Firefight at all. So I'm going to whiz through the rule book here and try not to get too stuck. It's 150 pages or so. So the main part of this starts off with some introduction, some firefighting, and yeah, here, the first thing that I'm not so keen about is the very first thing that you read about the universe is with the invention of the McKinley drive and so on, this idea about going out into space and how it was built and so on. It's a very passive view compared to the introduction to a lot of the 40k stuff, you know, with the Emperor standing immobile on the golden throne of Earth when chaos and aliens are destroying everything. It's a bit passive, and I'm not a huge fan of that. But having said that, I was really prepared for the fluff in this game to be very by the numbers. You know, you would expect dwarves to be stubborn and slow, and you would expect aliens to be aloof and mysterious, and to some degree that's true. But when I read the background, it really reminds me of that early Warhammer 40,000 background stuff before it started taking itself too seriously. I'll try and find some examples as I go through. So there's some background, there's some stories, and what you need to play. Now, you can see from here that there are counters involved, and I've bought a set of Magic the Gathering counters to represent all the things here. You can see suppression, activation, and so on. I may do with some different colored dice and so on, but you know, for the cost of a few counters, I found that my experience of playing is made a lot better. That's why I didn't feel too bad about buying the counters for War Machine ultimately. So, as you can see here, you've got the individual models of the smallest unit you can control, and unit leaders are very important. Unit leaders represent the point for which line of sight is drawn for shooting. Primarily, that's what you're going to be doing in the game until the end, when everything crunches together. So that's a really important part of it, and that hasn't been a big thing, I don't think, in any game really. I mean, even in Rogue Trader era and so on, the leader himself would be able to shoot, but the squad would kind of figure it out. And now the leader himself has to be able to see the target to order his squad to do so. Squad coherency around 1 inch. And you see in the bottom right corner here, there's very few modifiers in the game. There's probably around 6 or something in total. which is very, very different to Infinity, which I found for every single rule you learnt, there was another rule that counteracted it, and there would be pluses and minuses, and they would end each other out. You know, I've got mimetism, but you're in the long range band, but I moved, and you're in cover, and you're shooting through something, and you'd have so many modifiers that would stack up to give you a quote unquote realistic appraisal of the chances that this shot would hit. But ultimately, the fact that you had to abstract it so much actually takes you away from the action and the cutting point. You can always measure things, and you see here now, I'm probably front-loading this with things I'm not keen about, and that is the way that the units are set up. So if in the top right here, you can see how the stat lines look, and I really feel like they could have used a war gear chart or table separate from the units and have a more classical unit name on the left, columns for the stats, points, and then maybe what they're armed with on the side. And then they could have condensed their army lists much more effectively. Right now, you've got this weird grid view, which I'm sure makes sense when you're looking at something like Warpath, I guess, when you have units that are represented by grid-like regiment teams and so on, but it doesn't really work for me. So I've rewritten the stats for my units into an Excel spreadsheet in exactly that format. So yeah, and this is another thing that I'm not super keen about, and I will highlight that this is probably the only thing I'm not keen about, is that this whole thing around line of sight, they have around 4 pages of line of sight rules, and realistically it boils down to the unit leader needs to have line of sight to the target, and big things can be seen behind small things, and things behind other things that can be seen, like if you've got a dreadnought behind a squad of Marines, that dreadnought can be seen, but he'll get a cover bonus for being behind the unit. That's it. And there's a huge thing about shadows and geometry, and it's totally wasted. That whole thing could be 4 lines, so I don't like that at all. But now from this point onwards, as far as I'm concerned, it's totally gravy. So the idea is that you pick a mission, then you build your force, place some terrain, you're rolling for initiative, standard. Then you place some, they call them strategic assets, essentially objectives, and you know the actual objectives of the game. You know, whether it's take and hold, or to spread out, or to get the opponent's deployment zone, something like that. It's relatively simple. And you deploy. You deploy in an alternate fashion. So I deploy 1 unit, and you deploy 1 unit, and so on, and back and forth. So there's not this huge idea about alpha strikes. I found watching battle reports about Age of Sigmar that the game had been built around this idea of having this ultimate combo of turn 1 charges, or the ability to do one thing at one point in the game that would then win you or lose you the game at that point. And this is a lot more around reaction and changing plans. You know, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, that kind of thing. So you deploy it in alternate fashions. There's not really any scope, unless you choose to do it as part of a narrative campaign, for you to be totally surprised about what your opponent's bringing and where they're putting it, and getting outmaneuvered at that point in the game. Because I think maybe they're looking at it from a gaming perspective. It's not super fun to look at the board as soon as you started playing and realize that you've lost already, because your 60% of your army is in open cover, respective to like 10 heavy weapons batteries or something. So I think that's quite enjoyable, and they take that through all the mechanics of the game. So you got deployments, you got activations. Typically you'll roll off on activation unless the mission says otherwise, and then you alternate activations through the game as well. So each turn consists of us both moving everything that we've got, but I don't move all of mine and you move all of yours. I move 1 unit, you move 1 unit. I move 1 unit, you move 1 unit. And I say move, I mean utilize, move or shoot or run, whatever. There are a number of objectives in the game. I won't go through it all here. You have primary objectives you can use. If you want to get more detailed, you can have secondary objectives where you get little bonuses and penalties. And you can even have faction objectives where, you know, say the plague want to be able to kill as many people in close combat as possible or something like that. They'll get bonus things. But, you know, you can play a violent encounter here, objective 1, say encounter 1, mission 1. It's essentially what you would expect the typical skirmish game among friends at something like a Games Workshop shop would do. And there's quite a few here, 6. Right, now, the meat and potatoes of the game is the actual playing of the game. And as you can see here, it's broken down into turns. Each one, I alternate one activation with one of your activations. And when we've all both activated, that's the end of the turn and we start over again. The activations themselves consist of picking either 2 short actions or 1 long action. They can be in any order. So you can shoot and then move and then shoot, move and regroup, all that kind of stuff. Or for a long action, you can double move or triple move or whatever. And we alternate that until the end of the game, essentially, and who wins and loses. And the elegant simplicity of that is that you're encouraged by the objectives to not sit and fire at each other. And if you notice something is going on in one area of the battlefield, you have the ability to react to that in a meaningful way without being completely swept under the carpet. Because again, I'm sure that there is historical and theoretical evidence that could happen, but it's not really that fun. And this finds a really great balance between the crunch of actually playing a game and having to deal with the repercussions of your actions and not feeling like you're totally out of control and you have no agency to save yourself in times when you've made a fumble, but you have some possibility of recovering. So units have movement ranges. This has been removed from Warhammer 40,000, I believe, but it's not something that I've played. You know, my last game with Warhammer 40,000 was in the late 90s, when I think I just started playing 2nd edition. So you'll have to excuse me for not knowing what the current status of the rules are, but everyone's got a move action. Everyone's got a move rate, and they can move that rate. You know, and the idea of coherency is reversed as well for enemies. You know, the idea is you stay 1 inch away from all of your guys at maximum, and you can't be any closer than 1 inch from anyone else, whether that's friendly or enemy. You can interpenetrate during movement, but you can't end up. And the idea, you're meant to have these discrete squads of troops laying around. You can't do anything bananas like having Terminators peppering your front line to provide cover to units behind it. You know, the idea is that you're meant to have discrete squads in play. Yeah, and you can the engaging the enemy is essentially just moving. So there's no discrete charge function. You simply move into base to base, and if you can get one of your models into base to base with an enemy, that essentially is your charge. So you don't have to like say I'm going to charge and do nothing else. You could shoot and then move, and that movement could be into base to base contact, and then that would have been a charge. So you kind of get 3 moves in one. You get your shoot, your move, and then your assault, because assault happens immediately and it brings everyone together. So the unit that you've charged counts as being activated as well. So it's kind of a tornado of action in the middle of the battlefield. Now, there are not that many modifiers. You have the option here. You see charge reactions. This is part of the advanced rules if you have the starter set, essentially meaning that you can, if you haven't been activated already, you can move backwards. You can choose to do some kind of suppressive fire called Blaze Away. You can try and recover some suppression, which I'll come to shortly. You can remove an activation token, which means that if you see here, if you haven't reacted, you can react. If you have already reacted, then you have the ability to remove an activation token to allow yourself to fight back at full capacity. You know, if I have an orc squad or something that's been shooting and it gets charged by some marines, when in that combat, the marines will get an extra dice for charging, and I will have half dice because I've already activated. But that's kind of it. There's no more rules now. I'm not trying to gloss it over. That's it. So this idea being that you can mitigate that somewhat with a reaction here, and if you're on Overwatch, you can shoot. So yeah, you can't move off the board. The failed charges end up in a normal move. Yeah, you can measure at any time, but there could be a point when you charge someone and they react by shooting you so badly that you go to ground and you can't make it to the full range. There you go. So here you have your double move, your long action, and then disengage. The idea being that first round of combat, and you can trap people in combat. So I can charge my orcs can charge those Space Marines, and regardless of whether they've activated or not, they're now part of that combat. So if they hadn't activated, yeah, great, they can now. They can fight back, but now they count as activated as well. So we have to wait till the next turn, and maybe I'll have something more important to do that I need to get out of the way, and the Marines could use their activation to disengage. And there's no special rule back attack. No, that's not it. You just move out of combat. Again, that could be argued that, you know, in a more realistic sense, you wouldn't necessarily turn tail and run away from the enemy. I watched a Lindy Page episode where he discussed how back attacks were never really actually a thing, because you would never be right up close. You would always be at the tip of your close combat range with each other, so you could just turn around, or you could move back a little and just turn around, and no one could hit you, because the idea is you're limited your range anyway. But you can disengage here, and that gives you the ability to not be completely helpless if you find out that your shooting heavy, really fragile army has got into combat. They're not just going to get chewed up for the rest of the game. You can try and pull things back from the brink. The other short action is shoot. Now, we discussed the line of sight thing earlier on. It mentions it here as well. Pick your target, check for models. Essentially, is your leader in line of sight? Does that line of sight cross over an obstacle or another unit or something like that for more than half the unit? If so, the unit's in cover. That's it. And I don't think it takes rocket scientists to understand that if a tank is behind a unit of goblins, the tank can be seen. You get a cover save because the goblins are there, but I don't see. There was this big thing earlier on in the book about heights and relative heights and so on, and I think it was just complete waste. Here, so you can see these are all of the modifiers you have for shooting. No one has specific modifiers about long range or short range on their weapons. You simply get +1 to hit if you're within half the maximum distance of the weapon, which seems very broad, but it actually makes life so much easier. I watched a battle report about Shadow War Armageddon, and there were so many modifiers for like the first shot of the game. Like, I'm shooting at long range at a unit that has run through soft cover, so then it's, you know, it's -3 to hit this, and you're not realizing the benefits of the system by having so many steps. You're taking yourself out of it, and sometimes that's good, but I think a lot of times that is overemphasized in comparison to actually making tactical and strategic decisions that should be more wide-ranging, I think. So you just have one modifier here. You have one, this thing about the fire lane, the idea being that if you're in Overwatch and you happen to be in defensible cover, then you get a bonus. That's an advanced rule as well. Yeah, and the only modifier for cover is if the target is in cover. Remember, that's if the unit leader pulls their line of sight to more than half the unit through cover, then that's there. Fortified terrain is the most secure part of terrain. That's an advanced rule. It says see page 54. That the idea being that if you've got a bunker, then that provides one layer more. That's it. And if you're suppressed, I'll come to suppression. So if you can think of those, are you in short range? Is the target in cover? Am I suppressed? Ultimately, that's going to represent everything that you're going to be doing, for, 9 times out of 10 in any shooting action. And that's it. And your armor piercing here is when you do damage. So you simply roll to hit. So you might have an accuracy of 3 up, and you're in short range. So you would need 2s to hit. And then you roll to damage, and you look at the defensive ability of the target unit. We say it's a 5 up, and you've got an AP1 weapon. Then you need to roll 4 or higher to kill. And that's it. there's the so 4 high to kill if they got 1 wound. If they got multiple wounds, you can lay counters down, but the idea being that you try and remove whole models as much as possible. And that's it. And then at the end, you add some suppression markers. Now, suppression is a mechanic that I've come across in many games, and it has been extremely pivotal in the way the game plays out. So Chain of Command is a game where lots and lots of pinning happens, and the pinning builds up to really big numbers, and it's quite hard to get down. And the idea that units typically don't get killed, they get pinned and they get suppressed so much that they just kind of dissolve. Now, that is not how suppression works in Firefight. The suppression mechanic in Firefight is a lot more like managing heat in BattleTech. You know, I've not played or MechWarrior. I've not played the tabletop game, but if you played the video games, you shoot different weapons and it slowly builds up heat, and you got to maybe shoot this one a bit less and focus on that and so on. So suppression builds up. You get suppressed if you lose combat and you take wounds in combat. You get suppression if you get shot at. You get suppression if you take shooting damage. And that's kind of it. But the idea being that the units will build up that suppression. And units, like in Kings of War, have a nerve value. But in Kings of War, when that nerve value is reached, the unit disappears. In here, when that value is reached, it tends to be significantly lower. When it's reached, the unit is suppressed, which means it gets -1 to hit, -1 to do damage in close combat, -1 dice, I think, in close combat. And that's kind of it. And nothing happens until then it's double. And once it's double the nerve, then they go to ground. And at that point, they are really up the creek. For that moment in time, it's representing them completely losing their head at that moment in time. So the unit isn't immediately destroyed. You simply make a check, which I'll come to later, and they can almost always recover back to full health. But the idea is that you're blunted. The attack is blunted. The unit, if it happens to be really exposed, could be taken advantage of by the enemy. Not like that, but you know, could be killed easily because they've been shaken. But it's not an instant loss. Blaze away is when you're trying to do no damage, and all you're trying to do is add suppression markers. So sometimes that's very useful if you're being charged by a unit that's already got some suppression. You might just choose to blaze away and add as many as possible and hope that you get enough that they'll be unable to complete their charge. And splitting fire is the last piece. And again, this is something that is kind of built into 2nd edition 40k. That is that you can pick your charge, you can pick your targets. Not everyone has to shoot at everyone else. Especially if it's a high priority target or something. So in this case, if you have a missile launcher that can shoot at something different than your guys with pistols. That's it. If you have both groups of people with the separate weapons shooting at the same target, they're still only inflicting the one suppression marker for being hit and one for wounding. It's not double, but it just gives you the opportunity to split them or fire them in sequence. So maybe if you're shooting something that's got a shield, you might choose to shoot all of the like the machine guns first to try and deplete the shield, and then shoot the missile launcher afterwards. But as a group, that whole thing is happening in one action. And assault, like you see here, assault is exactly the same. You move into combat. You've got literally 3 modifiers there. I doubt you would use fortified terrain that frequently, and then you roll to damage. And it's the same. If you've got armor piercing, it gives you a modifier to be able to beat the target's defense. And if you're suppressed, it's more difficult. And there's no. If you're suppressed, it's more difficult in shooting because obviously your weapon doesn't get any weaker. But in combat, really, you're going to be your combat ability is going to be affected by your mental state. Yeah, I think. Use it to engage each other. Yes, it's in the text here somewhere. It mentions if you're on the ground. If you've activated, you're getting half the dice. So you remove casualties. You know, this section here is almost the same as the shooting section. You determine the winner, whoever side won, and that you can win but be destroyed, I guess. And there is a pushing mechanic. So after assault has happened, you can push your enemy away, and you can choose to follow up directly with them, or you could just be pushing them back. Back over the bridge, over the brink, so you can retreat yourself and put some space between you. So that's a nice thing there. You can also just kind of do like a shield wall push and just push the enemies back and break their line as well here, if you choose to do so. But then you're committing to another round of combat, or you're committing to receive a charge by units that are supporting the unit you've beat, and so on. And Overwatch here, again, I think Overwatch is making a return in 8th edition, Warhammer 40,000, but I never saw it lost. The idea being that you can choose to put your units, you can let your activation be that you are going to activate later in the turn. And that way you're forcing your opponent to play their hand. So maybe they've only got one unit left, and you want to see what they do before you commit your last unit. You can put your unit on Overwatch. They can then put their unit on Overwatch, and then you have to then use up that unit. Even if you do nothing, the Overwatch is used up at the end of the turn. And on the bottom right here, you see regroup and rally. Those are the ways that you remove suppression. You can remove one automatically, or D6+1 if you choose to do it as a long action here. And this is the section around suppression and how it reflects the way that the troops will react to being shot and hit and so on. And yes, you see here, anything up to the suppression tokens. So any suppression tokens up to its value of its nerve, half the speed, and they get that -1 to hit in everything and -1 to damage and assault. And yeah, if they happen to be suppressed while they're on Overwatch, they just miss their turn entirely. And this middle section here is going to ground, and that's when you really are in a brief period of extreme danger, because you can't take any actions other than to recover. You can't react to any charges. You can't fight back in assault. You can't issue any orders. So the recovery is essentially the mechanic that allows you to recover from this state. And really, you're rolling a nerve test per suppression marker, and any successes are fine, and any failures you either have to remove a model or fall back D3 inches towards your ward edge. And at the end of that, you remove D6+1, which is the same as that the earlier here, the rally action. You essentially get a rally for free at the end. So I had a situation where a bunch of assault enforcers had jumped into the middle of the board and got shot to pieces. So there were 5 of them. They got reduced to 2, and they had 8 suppression markers on them, which in any other game, in Kings of War, they would be dead, almost certainly. In Gates of Antares, they would be dead. In La Salle, they would be dead. And in Chain of Command, they would be dead. In this game, what that 8 tokens represented was them just cracking, or if you want to say that they're more professional, maybe making a tactical withdrawal to get out of danger as soon as possible. And so I rolled the dice, and I think I failed 1 or something. They have quite a high nerve value. So that one, no, I think I failed 3 or something. So I picked one of them to remove one of the models, and the other 2 to move back D3 inches each. And then I rolled a 5 to recover, and I removed. So that means I went from 8 markers to 2, and only 1 person actually died as a result of that. It's a parallel resource management thing in addition to wounds and so on. So it's a really nice mechanic that doesn't intrude too much, but it adds a lot of flavor to the game. Terrain here, yeah, I think this is probably just too much. It doesn't need to be done this in depth, really. I don't think so. Ultimately, you've got obstacles, not terrain, defensible terrain, and fortified terrain. And the idea being that defensible and fortified terrain you can move out of or move into, but not between, and you can shoot out of or into, but not through. And that's it. Yeah. Things like fortified terrain capacity strikes me as rules that they've been written in order to appease tournament-style competitive players. And it's ended up with a rule, some rules that I think are just not necessary. They're adding to the padding that I think could just be done without. Vehicles are not a separate rule set. So if you remember second edition, you had when you shot the vehicle, you had to roll to see where you hit. Once you see where you hit, you had certain armor values. Well, yeah, you hit a certain side, and that gave you the ability to hit certain parts of the vehicle, and they had different armor values, and then they had different damage tables and so on. And it was fun, but it was quite long-winded, and it would probably work in this context with, say, 2 or 3 vehicles per side. But in this game, essentially, they're treated as any other unit. They just simply have a very high resistance and a high defense. To mitigate that somewhat, any 6s you roll to hit, there is a special rule that all of these things come with. So this special rule is called Shredder, and it means that if you roll a 6 to damage anything, you can re-roll that 6 and keep re-rolling it over and over again, adding wounds each time until you stop rolling 6s. That's what you can do with vehicles. So to represent this, all attacks have the Shredder rule against vehicles, and the idea being that your vehicles are very tough, but if you can get past that toughness and really start doing some serious damage or get some lucky shots in, then they can be taken out. Now there's a small part in the middle of the page here about how vehicles will react to being destroyed. So I think this could have been a small table. If it's just destroyed by getting reduced to 0 wounds, it stays as a Hulk. If it exceeds, then it explodes with the amount of resilience that with a radius of the amount the wounds were exceeded by when it was destroyed. Yeah, with quite a lot of damage. D6 plus 3 or 4 and AP1. And the last one is if you double the value of the resilience, then you have that same thing, but then the vehicle itself is removed from play. It works. It works. It's good. It's probably got enough detail in it that you're going to get some kind of scenic, cinematic moments without over-egging it. And yes, shooting with vehicles is what you would imagine. Tanks, they don't get a discrete ram move. They effectively just bolt onto the assault rules. The idea is that you move your tank, and if it contacts an enemy unit, that counts as an assault, and that assault happens with the weapons. The weapons that are noted with an R in their range profile, which indicates that they are the ramming weapons for that vehicle. And that's it. Flyers, I've got absolutely no interest in, so I haven't even read that bit. And these are all the special rules, and the great thing about it is all of the army lists share these special rules. If it's anything like Kings of War, they might introduce another group of rules with a supplement, but no army will have specific rules to it. So anti-tank here will be the same for Plague as it will be for Forge Fathers, as it will be for Marauders. Everyone, if it represents something that has really high armor piercing values, then they will just have the anti-tank rule, which is something I really appreciate. And all of this here is all very easy to read and easy to come to. It's like three or four groups of pages. Yeah, and then that's up to that point. So that was maybe 40 pages in total with lots of diagrams. That's everything you need to play the game, really. Now, from this point onwards, it's more around some more advanced concepts. So command is something that allows the game to be taken to another strategic level. if I'm making parallels again to second edition, I would say it's a bit like Dark Millennium in the way that it added psychic powers to a game that was already complete without them. Command does kind of the same thing. Your units can have a value, a command value, and you sum all of those command values, and that gives you a pool of order dice. And then at any point, those commanders can issue commands that they have the ability to do so. So if you've got a command in here on the screenshot, it says Command Captain 2, you could, with him, he will contribute 2 dice to the pool, and he can also make any order up to difficulty level 2. And it's down to you to choose when you want to do these orders and when you want to hold them back. The idea is that you roll the dice to get some successes, and they get the successes are equal to the difficulty. So you know, if you have a pool of 3 and you need to do an order that's got 2 successes, you need to roll 2 in total. So you might choose to use a pair of dice to do that, but then you've only got 1 dice left for another order later in the turn. And the orders are just slightly modified versions of the things we discussed before. The idea that you can move and go on Overwatch, or you can reroll misses, or you can do an immediate rally without rolling for it. You know, that you can perform a triple move. These levels here, and there are some that are more specific, but I don't think they're very unusual. Sabotaging objectives, repairing things, and so on. And that's it. There's 74. That is actually all the rules. And now we get into the army lists. This section is quite nice, and this is where I started to read. I hadn't read much of the background, and I started to read this, and I found the stuff I was reading put a smile to my face in the way that it did reading very old White Dwarfs. So there's a section on putting together a Forge Father force. There are some special orders that only Asterians get on the right-hand side, and some objectives that only they get. And here you can see the format of the army lists. And I feel that this could have probably been done with more justice could have been done with this, because I think this vertical grid is probably a little less intuitive than it could otherwise be. Yeah, so these are the army lists, and this contains everything you need to play all of the armies that are presently in the game. I'm going to go to the end of the rules. So one of the more interesting concepts about this is the way that it portrays orcs, for example, as kind of genetically engineered super soldiers, which I thought that brought a smile to my face. And they rebel against the GCPS, who I guess are like the colonizing police force, which is why the enforcers exist. The enforcers were created to suppress the marauders, I believe, and that's quite cool. And you've got space vermin here, and you've got space skaven, sorry, and you've got space dwarfs. And those are just kind of nice factions. Here's some scenery. Yeah, and here's an index, a blank Firefight army list. I don't think this is a good format. And there is a quick play sheet here. I think that's pretty naff, honestly. Yeah, we'll check. I mean, I'll review that. And that's it. And that's a review of the Warpath Firefight rules. I played one demo game with some Space Marines on one side and with some pan-human Concord on the other, representing Enforcers and Asterians, and I had a great time, even just feeling my way through the rules. And I played a second time, and it was just as good the second time through. I printed off a quick reference sheet and didn't refer to it at all. It's so simple to play, and the complexity comes in with the decisions that you choose to enact, and the interactions between units that themselves have got very simple rules and very accessible rules. So if you're considering moving away from Warhammer 40,000, or you're trying to get back into a skirmish game and don't like the idea of paying 40 or 50 pounds for a 5-man squad of Chaos Marines, I would honestly consider checking out Firefight, because it does in my opinion, it does everything right.